Start digging. The gun was raised and the shovel was in the ground. What those 5 men would never change, would never walk back, was the moment the man on the ridge above them saw his sister at gunpoint and rode down to settle the score. He had been riding 4 days without real sleep when he crested the ridge above Seco Flats and looked down at the yard. 5 men. A pine coffin dropped sideways in the dirt near the porch steps. A long-handled shovel driven into the earth beside the garden gate, handle still swaying. And Nora, his sister, Tom Callahan's widow, 8 months alone on this land, standing on the porch steps with her hands pressed flat against her stomach, while a man with a pistol said the 4 words that carried all the way up to the ridge. Start digging, lady. He had spent 14 years making men like these regret mornings exactly like this one. He set his horse still for a moment. He looked at the coffin. He looked at the shovel. Then he rode down. Folks, welcome. If you are new here, tonight's story is set in the autumn of 1884 in the Pecos River country of New Mexico Territory, and it concerns a young widow named Nora Callahan, a water deed fraud so brazen it almost defied belief, and her brother Seth, a man who had put his pistols in a locked box under a floorboard and told himself, more times than he could count, that he was done with all of that. Subscribe before we go any further, because this one runs long and you are going to want all of it. And tell me in the comments where you are watching from tonight. What time is it where you are right now? Now, let's go back to the beginning. Back to how a widow, alone on 40 acres, came to find a coffin in her own yard on a Tuesday morning, and what happened when the wrong man rode home. Nora Callahan had been many things in her 28 years. She had been the youngest of 3 children on a hardscrabble Kansas homestead. She had been the one who stayed and helped her father clear a second field while her brothers rode west. She had been the woman who followed her husband, Tom Callahan, down to New Mexico Territory in the spring of 1882 when Tom came home with a land grant and a water deed and a look on his face like he had just been handed the future. She had been a wife for 2 good years and a widow for 8 months by the time this story really starts. Tom had died of a fever that came in fast in December of 1883 and left faster, leaving behind the 40 acres, the deed, and a daughter named May who had her father's eyes and her mother's stubbornness in equal measure. The land was good land. That was the problem. The 40 acres sat along the east fork of the Rio Seco, one of 3 permanent water sources in a stretch of high desert that was slowly drawing cattle ranchers in from Texas and Colorado. The water deed Tom had purchased gave him and his heirs the rights to divert and hold water from that fork for agricultural use, a deed that had been registered with the Santa Fe Territorial Land Office in 1882 and renewed in 1883. Nora did not know it when Tom died, but that little piece of paper was worth considerably more than the land itself to the right buyer. And the right buyer had been watching for 8 months. His name was Aldous Vane. That is the name you need to remember. Aldous Vane, who had arrived in the Pecos country 4 years earlier with a leather satchel, a banker's manner, and a way of looking at land surveys that suggested he was always counting something the rest of the room had not noticed yet. He ran the Territorial Savings and Trust in the town of Reyes Station, which sat 7 miles east of Nora's property along the Santa Fe Stage Road. The bank was legal enough, as banks in the territory went, but Vane had a side operation that was not legal at all, and it worked like this. He would identify a piece of land, water rights, mineral rights, anything with future value, and then he would wait for circumstances to create a vulnerable owner, a widow, a drought year, a man with gambling debts. Then his clerk, a pale and precise young man named Cutter Ames, would pull a blank loan contract from the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet. The real terms would be written in a different hand. The real amount, whatever Vane needed it to be, would be inserted after the signature was obtained. The document would be notarized by a man named Dawes who owed Vane a debt of his own and asked no questions, and then the collection would begin. Nora had signed a loan in February, 6 weeks after Tom's death, when the feed bill was overdue and May needed new shoes and the ground was still too frozen to plant. $40. She remembered it clearly. $40 at 8% interest, due in 12 months. She had read it twice before she signed. Sitting in the cold waiting room of Aldous Vane's bank, and Cutter Ames had watched her read it with that flat smile of his, and told her the terms were quite standard for the territory. She had taken the $40 and bought the feed and the shoes and 1 extra tin of coffee, because it had been a hard winter and she thought she deserved a small luxury. She had not thought about it again until Vane's men showed up at her gate in late August and told her she owed $460. Not 40. Not 40 with interest. 460. Because Cutter Ames had rewritten the loan for $400 after she walked out the door, added the compounding clause, and had Dawes stamp it with a seal that looked official enough to hold up in a territorial court against the word of a widow with no lawyer. $460. Nora did not have $4 in the house. She had the land, the water deed, a milk cow, 2 horses, her daughter, and a garden that was almost ready to harvest. She had a brother somewhere in Arizona Territory who she had not heard from in a year. She had a neighbor, old Delphine Ruiz, who lived 2 miles north and came by twice a week, and who had listened to Nora describe the loan notice that first arrived in July and said, with the kind of directness that very old women sometimes permit themselves, "That man is going to take your water deed and there is nothing a judge in this territory is going to do about it because Vane owns the judge." Nora had written to the Santa Fe land office. She had received a form letter. She had written again and received no reply. She had written to Seth's last known address in Arizona and was not sure the letter had arrived. And then August had come, and with it, the 5 men. They arrived on a Tuesday morning, which was significant only because Tuesday was the day Delphine usually came by and did not that week, which meant Nora was alone with May when the wagon rolled through the gate. The man driving the wagon was called Foley, big through the shoulders, a drinker's red complexion, a rifle balanced across his knees with the ease of someone who had carried one that way for a long time. Beside him sat a younger man named Brocious, narrow-faced and quick-eyed, who jumped down from the wagon before it had fully stopped and walked to the back and pulled out the pine coffin with the practiced efficiency of a man for whom this was not the first time. The other 3 came on horseback. Their names were Dex, Pruett, and a man everyone called Thresh, who had a scar across his lip from some old disagreement, and had never in Foley's memory said anything that could be called unnecessary. They were not, individually, remarkable men. Foley drank too much, and had a mean streak that came out when he had been drinking, and a deadline to meet. Brocious was ambitious in the small, treacherous way of men who lacked the character for anything larger. Dex had once been a territorial deputy and had been dismissed for reasons the territorial marshal's office had kept quiet. Pruett was simply practical. He did whatever Foley told him, took his $20 a collection job, and spent the money on cards. Thresh was the one that made the hair on the back of a person's neck stand up, not because of anything he did, but because of the quality of his stillness. He watched. He calculated. He did not seem to feel impatience or uncertainty, and that absence of ordinary human feeling gave him a quality that Foley occasionally found useful and more often found unsettling. These were the 5 men who dropped a pine coffin in Nora Callahan's yard on a Tuesday morning in August of 1884. Foley climbed down from the wagon after Brocious and walked to the garden gate and banged on it with the heel of his hand. Nora came out onto the porch and looked at the coffin and then at Foley and said nothing. May was behind her, pressed to the doorframe, watching with those Tom Callahan eyes. Foley told her she had 3 days to produce $460, or Mr. Vane would be taking the deed of trust on the property as satisfaction. He said the coffin was not a threat. He said this with the flat tone of a man who knew it was absolutely a threat, but was what they had used to haul something else out from town, and he had left it in her yard because he had not gotten around to putting it back in the wagon. He nodded to Brocious, who picked up the shovel and drove it into the earth beside the garden gate, handle swaying, as though marking a spot. Foley watched Nora watch the shovel go into the ground. Then he said, in a quiet voice that was somehow worse than shouting, "Start digging, lady. Because if you are not out of this property in 3 days, you are going to need that hole, one way or another." He climbed back onto the wagon, and the 5 of them rode back through the gate and east toward Reyes Station. Nora stood on the porch steps for a long time after the dust settled. May came out and pressed her face against her mother's arm. Nora put a hand on her daughter's head and looked at the coffin lying on its side in the yard and the shovel standing beside the gate, and she said nothing. There was nothing to say. She had written every letter she could think to write. She had no money. She had no lawyer. She had a neighbor who had already told her the judge was bought. The thing that was going to happen was going to happen unless something else happened first, and she could not see what that something else was going to be. That night she sat at the kitchen table and wrote another letter to Seth's Arizona address, knowing it might not reach him in time and knowing it might not matter. She told him about the loan. She told him about the coffin. She wrote it out plainly, without drama, the way their mother had taught them both to communicate facts. You say the thing that happened. You say what you need. You say thank you. She sealed it and set it on the corner of the table to go out with the stage the next morning. Then she went to bed and lay awake listening to the Pecos wind move across the flats, and tried not to think about what 3 days meant. She had not been awake when Seth crested the ridge. She did not know, in the morning when she came out to fetch water, that her letter had never needed to be written. Seth's horse was at her water trough. Seth himself was sitting on the porch steps in the early light, arms resting on his knees, watching the yard with the particular quality of attention that she remembered from childhood, and that she had always associated with him being about to do something careful and consequential. He was 33 years old, and he looked older than that, in the way that men who have spent time outdoors in hard country sometimes do, lean and weathered, with a stillness to him that sat differently on a man of 33 than it had sat on a boy of 19. He had grown the beard out. He was wearing a dusty gray coat she did not recognize. He looked up when she pushed open the door, and he said, "Your letter didn't get to me. I was already on my way." Nora sat down beside him on the steps. She told him about the loan in February. She told him about the loan notice in July, the $460, the Cutter Ames forgery, the judge she could not trust. She told him about Tuesday, the 5 men, Foley, the coffin, the shovel in the garden gate. Seth listened, without interrupting, which was how he had always listened. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking at the shovel still standing where Brocious had put it. Nora had not moved it. She did not know why she had not moved it. It seemed important to leave it there until someone told her what to do next. Seth said, "What time do they come?" Nora said they had come in the morning the first time, and she assumed they would come in the morning again. Seth nodded. He said, "Go get May up. I want you both in the house today. Don't come out for any reason until I come for you." He paused. "The shovel can stay where it is for now." Nora looked at him for a moment. She wanted to ask him something. She was not entirely sure what, but what she said instead was, "Are you going to get hurt?" Seth looked at her with an expression that was almost a smile. "Not planning on it," he said. She went inside. Seth sat on the porch and finished the coffee in his tin, and looked at the yard and the coffin and the shovel and the ridge he had come down the night before, and he let himself think about what came next in the careful, sequential way he had learned to think about such things a long time ago in a different part of the territory. He had put his guns away 8 years back. That was not a figure of speech. He had literally taken the 2 Colt single-action revolvers he had carried since he was 22, wrapped them in oilcloth, put them in a cedar box, and locked that box under the floorboard of the room he rented in a Tucson boarding house. He had not been a lawman. He had not been an outlaw. He had been, for about 6 years of his life, a man that other men called when there was a problem that ordinary men and ordinary solutions could not resolve, a middle space between law and violence that the territory required in those years, and that consumed a specific kind of person. He had been good at it. That was not something he was proud of. It was simply a fact. The way some men are good at figures or good at carpentry. He had left that life because he was tired of it, and because a friend of his had died doing it, and because he thought that somewhere in the world there was a version of himself that he had never quite gotten around to being. He had gone to Arizona and worked horses, and tried to find out what that version looked like. He had done all right. He was still looking. He rode into Reyes Station that afternoon. He left his horse at the livery and walked to the Territorial Savings and Trust, and stood outside it for a moment reading the sign. Then he walked inside and waited while Cutter Ames looked up from his ledger with the flat professional smile that Nora had described. Seth told him he was Nora Callahan's brother, and that he had some questions about the terms of her loan. Cutter Ames listened with that smile in place, nodded, and said the terms were clear, and the debt was legally established, and that if Mrs. Callahan had concerns she was welcome to engage a lawyer, though of course the territorial courts were busy and the timeline for such things could be quite lengthy. Seth listened. He asked, politely, to see the original loan document. Cutter Ames said the original document was the bank's property and not available for general inspection. Seth said he understood. He thanked Cutter Ames for his time and walked back out onto the stage road. He did two other things in Reyes Station that afternoon. He stopped at the telegraph office and sent a wire to Santa Fe. Not to the land office, which Nora had already tried, but to a man named Corbin Falk who worked for the Territorial Attorney General's office, and who owed Seth a debt of a different kind. The kind that does not go away with time, the wire said. Pecos Country water deed fraud. Manufactured loan. Forged contract. Notary on payroll. Need examiner within 72 hours. Callahan water deed Reyes Station Vane Bank. The second thing he did was buy a coffee at the station house and sit at the corner table and listen to the two men at the bar talk about Vane and the bank and the collection crew and what the word around Reyes Station was about. Vane's plans for the Rio Seco water rights. He sat and drank his coffee and did not say anything and learned what he needed to know. Then he rode back to Nora's. He spent the first part of the evening doing something that would have looked, to anyone watching, like the work of a man with too much time and too much patience. He went to the tool shed behind the house and came out with a carving knife and a lantern and a length of pine board, and he sat at the work table outside and carved. He was not making furniture. He was not making anything decorative. He was making markers, 5 of them, each one a rough plank, each one with a name carved into it in letters deep enough to read clearly in poor light. Foley, Brocious, Dex, Pruitt, Thresh. He carved each name with care, the way you do something you want to last. Nora came to the doorway once and looked at what he was doing and said nothing and went back inside. After that he walked the yard in the dark, learning it. He walked it slowly, without a light, because he wanted to know it the way you know a room you have lived in, by feel, by the sound the ground made under his boots, by where the fence sat relative to the garden, and where the garden sat relative to the porch, and where the porch sat relative to the road. He stood at the gate for a long time, looking out toward the stage road, and then he went back inside and slept. The men came back in the morning, as Nora had thought they would. And the morning was the kind that happens in August in New Mexico. Cool and still. The sky just going from gray to pale blue over the mesa, the air carrying the smell of sage and something damp from the creek. Foley drove the wagon with Brocious beside him again. The 3 riders came up behind. They rode through the gate, and they stopped. What they found in the yard was not what they had expected to find. They had expected an empty yard. They had expected either capitulation, a deed on the porch, a woman gone, or the plain evidence of a woman who had not left because she had nowhere to go and no money to get there, and would need to be dealt with in a direct way that Foley preferred not to think about in advance. What they found was different from either of those things. 5 pine planks were driven into the earth in a row along the near side of the garden path, evenly spaced, each one with a name carved into it in letters large enough to read from the wagon seat. Foley's name was on the first one. He stared at it. He read it twice, because he was not the fastest reader and because he wanted to be certain he had read it right. Then he read the others: Brocious, Dex, Pruitt, Thresh. And then all 5 men were staring at their own names in the ground, and the yard was very quiet. The man who came around the corner of the porch had a tin cup in one hand. He was wearing the gray coat. He was not carrying a visible weapon. He sat down on the porch steps, put the cup down on the step beside him, and looked at all 5 of them with an unhurried quality that is very specific to men who have been in situations of this kind many times before, the quality of someone who has already run the calculation and knows how it comes out. "Morning," he said. He let the words sit there. Foley found his voice. He asked who the man was. Seth said he was Nora Callahan's brother. He said he had spent most of the previous evening thinking about all of them, which was why he had taken the time to learn their names and get them spelled right. He said he hoped they appreciated accuracy. It was Thresh who recognized him. Thresh was the one who was always watching, always calculating, and he had ridden through enough of the territory's hard years to know the names that mattered. He leaned forward on his horse slightly and studied Seth's face, and then he said one word to Foley, quietly: a name. Seth's full name, and Foley turned to look at Thresh and then back at Seth, and his expression changed in a way that Nora, watching from the window with May pressed against her side, did not entirely understand but filed away. Seth looked at Thresh. He said, "I'm surprised it took you that long." Foley said he did not know what any of this was about, that they had a legal debt to collect, that the courts had recognized the loan, and they had paperwork. Seth said the paperwork was a forgery, and that Cutter Ames had written $400 into a $40 loan after Nora walked out of the bank, and that the notary who had stamped it was on Vane's payroll. He said he had wired the Territorial Attorney General's office the previous afternoon, and that a banking examiner was riding out from Santa Fe on today's stage, which meant he would be in Reyes Station by evening. He said that Aldous Vane's banking license would be suspended within 48 hours, and that the manufactured loan against Nora Callahan's property would be among the first things reviewed, along with every other similar loan Vane's bank had written against Rio Seco water rights in the past 3 years. He said this in the way he said everything, plainly, without decoration, without any particular emphasis, the way you state facts that are simply facts. Then he picked up his coffee cup and held it with both hands, and looked at Foley over the rim of it and said, "Now, you are welcome to ride back to Reyes Station and tell Aldous Vane what I have told you, which I think is the sensible course. Or you can decide that Vane's $20 collection fee is worth what comes next." He nodded at the 5 carved name planks in the ground. "Those took me about 2 hours. I am in no hurry." Brocious was the one who spoke first, because Brocious had the ambition without the calculation. He said, who did Seth think he was, coming on to Vane's business with his coffee cup and his carved sticks and his territory bluster, and pulled the pistol from his belt. He did not point it. He held it sideways, the half-raised gesture of a man who wants the gun to do the talking, without quite committing to shooting anyone. It was a miscalculation. What Seth did next was not fast. Exactly. It was simply precise, in the way that a thing done 10,000 times can become precise. He set the cup down on the step beside him. He stood. His right hand moved. The pistol, one of the 2 Colt Peacemakers he had retrieved from the cedar box under the Tucson floorboard before he started riding north, the ones wrapped in oilcloth, the ones he had told himself he was done with, was in his hand. And it was not held sideways, and it was pointed at Brocious. The yard went completely still. Seth said, quietly, "Put it away." Brocious looked at the gun in Seth's hand for a long moment. Then he put his own weapon back in his belt. His jaw was tight. His eyes were not quite steady. Foley, beside him on the wagon, had not moved at all. Thresh had not moved. Dex had his hand halfway to his rifle on his saddle ring and had stopped it there, and was staring at his own stopped hand, with the expression of a man who has just realized he came very close to doing something permanent. Seth lowered the Colt. He did not put it away. He held it at his side and looked at all 5 of them in turn, the way a man looks at things he has already accounted for. And then he said, "Tell Mr. Vane that the Rio Seco water deed is not for sale and is not subject to a fraudulent lien. Tell him the Attorney General's office has been notified. Tell him his notary is going to be asked some questions he is not going to enjoy answering. And tell him," Seth paused, picked up the coffee cup again with his left hand, because he could, "that the next man who drives a shovel into this yard is going to find it has already been spoken for." Foley looked at his name in the ground. He looked at Seth. He looked at Thresh, who was watching Seth with the unreadable attention he gave to anything he considered genuinely dangerous. And Thresh gave one slow nod, the nod of a man communicating, as plainly as possible, that the arithmetic of this situation had already been worked out, and the result was not favorable. Foley turned the wagon around. It took a moment, in the yard, but he turned it around. The 3 riders followed. They went back through the gate and east toward the stage road, and the dust came up behind them and then settled. Nora came out onto the porch. May was at her side. She looked at the 5 carved name planks in the ground and then at Seth and then back at the gate. Seth put the peacemaker away. He picked up his coffee cup and finished the last inch of it. "That's it?" Nora said. Seth considered this. "For today," he said. He was right that it was not entirely finished. The 5 men rode back to Reyes Station and went directly to Aldous Vane's office, and Foley told him what had happened, and Vane did not receive the news well. Vane was a man who had built his particular operation on the certainty that the people he targeted had no recourse, no money for lawyers, no connections in Santa Fe, no one who was going to ride 4 days to stand between them and the paperwork. The appearance of Seth disrupted a basic assumption of Vane's business model, and men like Vane, when a basic assumption is disrupted, often respond by pressing harder rather than retreating. Vane told Foley to go back. He told him to take 3 more men and to go back that evening and to make it clear, in whatever terms were necessary, that the Callahan deed was going to be surrendered. He said that 1 man with a gun and a message from the Attorney General's office did not change the legal standing of the loan. He said that the loan was notarized and filed, and that 1 telegraph wire from a territorial attorney's clerk was not going to overturn it overnight. He was not entirely wrong about this. What he was wrong about was the part where Foley and 6 men showed up at a dark yard and found it exactly as they had left it. Seth had spent the afternoon doing 2 things. The first was riding the 4 miles to Delphine Ruiz's place and telling her what was happening and asking her to go to the stage depot in Reyes Station and meet the examiner from Santa Fe and guide him back. Delphine had said yes without any particular expression of surprise, which suggested she had been expecting some version of this for some time. The second thing Seth did was prepare the yard. When the 7 men came through the gate at 10:30 that night, moving quietly, expecting a dark farmhouse with a sleeping man inside, they found the yard was not dark. There was a lantern burning on the gate post. There was a lantern burning on the corner of the porch. And there were the 5 carved name planks standing in the ground by the garden, illuminated, visible from the gate, which meant, Seth had calculated, that every man who rode through the gate would read his own name in the first 10 seconds. Seth was not on the porch. He was at the far corner of the house, standing in a shadow, the angle giving him a clear line to the gate and the yard and the approach from the road. He watched the 7 men come in. He watched them stop at the planks and look at the names. He watched Foley look at his name and then start looking for Seth in the wrong direction, which was the porch. The detail that mattered, and Seth had arranged it specifically, was that when you came through the gate and read the planks, and looked at the porch, you were already inside the yard. The gate was behind you, and the man who had put the planks there was beside the house where you were not looking. He stepped out of the shadow. He said, in a level voice that carried clearly in the night air, "That's far enough." 7 men on horseback in a small yard at night is a confined and complicated situation. Horses shift. Men who were sure of themselves in daylight find the quality of their certainty changes somewhat in the dark when a voice comes from a direction they were not watching. Foley's horse moved sideways. 2 of the 3 new men, range hands Vane had pressed into this, reached for rifles out of the habit of men who reach for rifles when surprised, then stopped that motion when they realized what they were reaching for, and what reaching for it would mean. Seth said, "I want you to hear something before anybody does anything they are going to regret." He told them, standing at the corner of the house in the lantern light with both hands visible, that the banking examiner from Santa Fe had arrived in Reyes Station on the afternoon stage and that he was at this moment in the office of the Territorial Savings and Trust with Delphine Ruiz and a deputy from the Territorial Marshal's office, conducting an emergency review of the bank's loan records. He said that the notary, whose name was Dawes, had been visited that same afternoon by a man from the Attorney General's office and had, faced with the prospect of criminal liability for his role in several fraudulent instruments, provided a sworn statement describing the arrangement. He said that Aldous Vane's banking license had been provisionally suspended at 7 that evening, and that Cutter Ames was at present answering questions he was not enjoying. He paused. He let that sit. Then he said, "There is no debt. There never was one beyond $40. Which Nora paid back in May with interest at the legal rate." He said the manufactured loan had been voided under the Territorial Banking Fraud Statute, Chapter 14, Section 3, which he had read from the copy in the Santa Fe Land Office Registry, and which he could quote at length if anyone present felt they needed to hear it. "The deed stays with Nora Callahan. The water rights stay with Nora Callahan. Every one of you who rode out here tonight on Vane's word is going to be asked, in the next few days, what you knew, and when you knew it, and what you were doing on this property." He let that thought settle on each of them individually. "Go home," he said. "All of you." There was a long silence in the yard. Foley looked at the planks with his name on them. He looked at the house. He looked at Seth. He was thinking about $20, which was what Vane was paying, and about Dawes giving a sworn statement, and about a territorial marshal's deputy sitting in Vane's bank at this moment, and none of those things added up to anything that made going further into this yard worthwhile. He turned his horse around. The others followed. The 3 new men first, then Pruitt, then Dex, then Brocious, who lingered a moment too long looking at Seth, until Thresh put a hand on his arm and pulled him along. Thresh was the last one through the gate. He paused there and looked back at Seth for a moment. The long, calculating look of a man who is resetting his estimate of something, and then he rode out, and the gate swung shut behind him and the lanterns burned quietly in the empty yard. Nora came out of the house. She had May with her, which Seth noticed and did not comment on. He understood the impulse. When you have been afraid for a long time, you do not want to be alone even for the moment the fear ends. She stood on the porch steps and looked at the yard, the planks, the lanterns, the gate swinging. She said, "What happens now?" Seth told her about the examiner and Dawes, and the suspended license. He told her that the Territorial Attorney General's office was going to open a formal inquiry into Vane's lending practices and that, based on what the examiner found, he expected Vane to be facing criminal fraud charges. He said that Nora's water deed was secure, that the manufactured lien was void, and that no one from Vane's bank was going to be riding out to her property again in any official capacity. Nora was quiet for a moment. She looked at the shovel still standing by the gate. Brocious's shovel, still in the same spot, still swaying faintly in the night breeze. She said, "Can I move it now?" Seth said she could move it whenever she liked. She went and pulled it out of the ground. She carried it around to the tool shed and put it inside and came back without it. That was, Seth thought, the right response to a shovel someone had planted in your yard as a threat. You put it somewhere useful and you went on. The next morning, Corbin Falk's man from the Attorney General's office rode out to introduce himself and confirm the details. His name was Aldridge. Young, careful, a little sunburned from the ride, carrying a leather satchel that contained, among other things, copies of 3 other fraudulent loan instruments Vane's bank had issued against Rio Seco water rights in the preceding 2 years. He told Nora that the state would be looking to recover damages for the affected landowners, and that her case was going to be central to the inquiry, which meant she would need to provide a statement and be available for the proceedings. He told her this would take some months. He asked her if she had legal representation. Nora said she did not. Aldridge said the Attorney General's office would appoint one, as she was a primary witness, and that she should not worry about the cost. He looked at Seth and said, "Your wire was well timed." He said it the way men say things when they mean more than the surface of the words. Seth said he appreciated the speed of the response. Aldridge looked at the carved name planks still standing in the garden path, and then looked back at Seth and decided not to ask about them. Some things in the territory were better left as facts, without an explanation attached. That afternoon, Corbin Falk's inquiry turned up something that nobody had entirely expected, which was the actual original loan document, the one Nora had signed, in her own handwriting, for $40 at 8%. Cutter Ames had made the mistake common to careful forgers, which is that they keep the original, because destroying it feels like destroying proof of their own competence. The original was in an envelope in the false bottom of the filing cabinet behind the teller window. It had Nora's signature. It had the $40 figure. It had the legal rate. It had the date. It was, in short, exactly what Nora had described. The examiner sealed it as evidence and wrote in his field notes that the fraud was about as clear a case as he had seen in 5 years of this kind of work. And he had seen some clear cases. Aldous Vane was arrested the following day by the Territorial Marshal on 3 counts of banking fraud, with additional counts expected to be filed as the inquiry continued. Cutter Ames turned state's evidence almost immediately, which was perhaps not a surprise. Cutter Ames was a practical man who understood ledgers and who had looked at the ledger of his current situation and found the balance unfavorable. Dawes, the notary, had already provided his statement. The judge, that Delphine Ruiz had said was in Vane's pocket, proved to be smarter than that, or at least more concerned with his own future than Vane's, and declined to involve himself in the proceedings in any way that could be construed as interference. The Territorial Savings and Trust had its license suspended for 90 days pending investigation, its depositors notified, and its outstanding loan instruments reviewed one by one for fraud. 3 other water deed holders on the Rio Seco received letters from the Attorney General's office informing them that manufactured liens against their properties had been voided. Nora's real debt, $40 with legal interest over 8 months, which came to $44 and change, was officially discharged. The records showed she had actually overpaid in May by $3 and some cents, which the Attorney General's office noted in the settlement and which Nora added to the coffee tin she kept in the back of the kitchen cupboard for emergencies. Seth stayed for 6 days. He helped Nora repair the section of fence along the creek that had been sagging since spring. He rehung the gate, which had been loose on its post. He spent 2 afternoons in the barn with May, who turned out to have an aptitude for horses and a set of opinions about them that she delivered with considerable authority for a 7-year-old. He ate his sister's cooking, which was the best thing he could think of about the past 6 days, except for the outcome of the other parts, and he slept without any of the particular quality of listening that he had been doing for most of his adult life. On the 6th morning, he was up before Nora and had his horse saddled by the time she came out. She did not ask him to stay. She understood. because she had always understood the particular way Seth was wired, that the thing he was looking for, the quieter version of himself that he had been trying to find in Arizona, was not going to be found on a piece of land where a problem had just been solved in a way that reminded him of the person he had been when he was doing that kind of thing full time. He needed to get back to the horses and the ordinary difficulty of a life that did not require his particular set of skills. She understood this, even if she wished it were different. She came down the porch steps and stood beside his horse. She said, "Are you going to write more this time?" Seth said he would try. She said, "Try harder." He almost smiled. He paid her the $40, the original loan amount, the thing she had actually borrowed, the number that had started all of this. He took it from the inside pocket of the gray coat and put it in her hand in cash, coins, and 2 bills. He said it was not anything except what she had needed in February when the ground was frozen and the feed bill was due, and that she should use it for whatever came next that she needed. She started to say something and he shook his head and she stopped. He rode out through the gate and up the ridge to the south. Nora stood at the gate and watched him go until the gray coat disappeared over the rise. May came out and stood beside her and took her hand, and the two of them stood there for a moment in the morning light. The carved name planks were still in the garden path. Nora had not moved them yet. She thought she might leave them for another day or two. Not as a monument, not as a threat to anyone, just because she had looked at them several times over the past 6 days and each time felt something that she did not quite have a word for, but that was in the neighborhood of reassurance, the knowledge that there were people in the world who, when you were in trouble you could not get out of on your own, would ride 4 days without real sleep and carve names into wood by lantern light and sit on your porch steps with a coffee cup until the people who meant you harm had gone home. She moved them on Thursday. "Now, partner, I want to talk to you for a moment about what this story is really about, because it is not about guns and it is not about a con man's fraud, though it is about those things too. What this story is about is the quality of showing up, the things Seth did that most people, in a life of ordinary days and ordinary distances, will never have to do, but that some people are called on to do, and that costs something and that matters. Seth had put those guns away because he was tired of what he was and because he thought he could become something else. And maybe he was right about that. But he was also the person who, when the thing that was going to happen to Nora was going to happen, got on his horse and rode. He did not wait to hear how bad it was. He did not wait to see if she could handle it another way. He was already moving before the letter was written, because some part of him that he could not entirely account for had known something was wrong. The territory in 1884 was full of men like Aldous Vane. Men who looked at the gap between what the law said and what the law was actually able to enforce on any given stretch of high desert, and decided that gap was a business opportunity. It was also, if you knew where to look, full of men like Seth, men who had been shaped by the hard years into something specific and useful, who carried that thing around with them like a tool they had not been able to put down no matter how much they wanted to. Most of them never talked about what they could do. Most of them would have preferred not to be needed. But the fact that they were there, out in the country somewhere, moving quietly from one place to the next, that fact mattered to the people who were standing in a yard with a coffin and a shovel and no one to call. Nora kept the water deed. She farmed the land for another 30 years. May grew up and married a man who built a bridge over the east fork of the Rio Seco and raised 4 children in a house on the slope of the same ridge where Seth had sat his horse on that August morning. Seth wrote more regularly, as he had promised. He never went back to the kind of work he had done before. He found the quieter version of himself eventually, or something close to it. A horse ranch in the mountains above Tucson. A small and decent life. A couple of people he trusted. The peacemakers stayed in the cedar box, mostly. He took them out sometimes to clean them. He put them back. Aldous Vane spent 3 years in the Territorial Prison at Santa Fe and came out a quieter man, which happens sometimes. Cutter Ames served 18 months and went east and became, by all accounts, a salesman of some unremarkable commodity, which seems appropriate. Dawes lost his notary commission and moved to Colorado. Foley drifted north and was not heard from again in the Pecos country. Brocious, Dex, and Pruitt each paid a $50 fine for trespassing on private property with an unlicensed intent to coerce, which was the specific charge that Aldridge, displaying a legal creativity that Seth had not expected, managed to make stick. They paid and rode on. Thresh disappeared. He had always been the kind of man who disappeared. The 5 carved nameplanks stayed in Nora's tool shed for the rest of her life. She never threw them away. She could not entirely say why. Partly it was the same feeling she had had that morning before Thursday, the reassurance value, the physical evidence that something real had happened and had turned out the way it turned out. Partly it was a feeling harder to name, which had to do with Seth sitting at the work table by the lantern and doing something that precise and careful with a knife and a piece of wood. Not in anger, not as a display, but as preparation, as the quiet, unhurried work of a man who had decided that his sister's safety was what the next 12 hours were for. She had watched him through the window that night, though she had not told him she was watching. She had watched his face in the lantern light, and she had thought, this is what a brother looks like when he has come to do a thing and has no doubt that the thing needs doing. She kept the planks. They were in the tool shed in a crate in the corner, under an old piece of canvas. When May went through the shed after Nora died in 1914, May took them out and looked at each one. Foley, Brocious, Dex, Pruitt, Thresh, the names still clear and deep in the wood after 30 years. And she sat in the door of the tool shed for a while thinking about a story her mother had told her when she was small and that she had heard again in pieces over the years. Then she wrapped them back in the canvas and put them in the crate and kept them too. Some things you keep because they are the shape of a story you want to be able to tell. Some things you keep because they are the shape of the thing you needed once, and someone provided it, and you have not yet found anything that adequately takes their place. That is the story of the widow on the Rio Seco, and the 5 men with a coffin, and the brother who rode 4 days to be there. If it moved you even a little bit, do me a favor and subscribe. It keeps these stories going, and it means the next one finds its way to you when it is ready. And leave me a comment. I want to know where you are listening from tonight. What territory are you in right now? It is late where I am, and the fire is low, and there are more stories where this one came from. Come back for them. I will be here.